There are quite a few movies that came out that I truly regret not seeing in theaters. Mostly films that came out during the 1990s. Like, in my formative years, I saw a lot of movies. But I had this really odd aversion to trying to never see a movie alone. I hated it. I needed someone to talk to about the experience after it was all over. I needed someone to share in that experience. If I didn't have it, I felt like I was missing out on the film's true purpose. As a result of growing older, we get jobs, we get lives, we keep moving forward, but when you're a teenager who is trying to get out on their own when responsibility is low, a job is a key to everything. But that means that it takes priority over hanging out with your friends during the summer and seeing a movie whenever the notion moves you. 1997 was like that for me. As I was finishing up my freshman year of high school, I got a job working at a label making factory as a quality control personnel. This mostly meant that I just made sure that the labels had no smudges and were properly sorted. I couldn't complain, the job was fun, and it paid $6 an hour, which was 50 cents more than minimum wage at that time in Oregon. My best friend, on the other hand, who was my go-to movie buddy, was also working, but at Dairy Queen. So our schedules barely synced up to do anything, let alone go to the theaters. It was because of that, and my stupid dislike about not seeing a movie by myself, that I missed out on probably the coolest science fiction movie of the year in theaters. I still kicked myself in the ass a bit whenever I watched The Fifth Element, because for a 24-year-old movie, it still slaps. And it slaps effing hard. A lot of people think that Starship Troopers was the better film, and in some ways they are correct. The Paul Verhoeven bug-smashing flick was a great time, and the movie still remains one of my absolute favorites. But its deep satire for the military-industrial complex is one that was way more topical at the time, even though now it still has its own footing. Luc Besson's science fiction epic was just cool, and quite frankly, nothing has really seemed to come close to recapturing that magic sense, and not even Luc Besson himself has been able to catch lightning in a bottle twice. But we're not talking about Valerian right now. The key thing about The Fifth Element that speaks to me, especially as a teenager who dreamed of making movies in Hollywood, was how the movie began. One of the key bits of movie trivia at the time that you'd see in the slideshow before the movie began was that Luc Besson started writing The Fifth Element when he was just 16 years old. Even though I didn't see the movie in theaters, I did see that factoid pop up. Quite a bit, in fact. And it always stuck with me. It heavily inspired me to start writing more stories in hopes of setting myself down the path of long-term success like Besson did. What can I say? I was a very idealistic youngster with hopes for fortune and glory in Tinseltown. My experiences in Hollywood nearly a decade and a half later didn't turn out that exact way, but those are stories for another time. Now, Luc Besson himself is a prolific filmmaker. No matter what you may think of him now, he is always better than his worst work, and I still think he has some good films left in him. And he was just cleared of renewed rape charges a couple weeks ago, so that's good, right? Honestly, I don't even want to jump into that mess, but I do want to talk about his movies, specifically this movie. When Luc Besson was 16 years old, he was bored, as many teenagers are, so he started writing. His original idea was about a nobody named Zaltman Bleros, who in the year 2300 wins a trip to the Club Med resort on the planet Floston Paradise. It was here where Zaltman meets Lilu, a sand girl who is over 2,000 years old, and she doesn't age. Thankfully, the name Zaltman Bleros didn't stick, and the much cooler Korben Dallas did. You can start to see a few key elements from the finished script that originated here, and Besson thankfully didn't stick with this particular story forever. He did the one thing that personally I'm terrible at, and that's continuous revisions. Besson kept plugging away from 1975 all the way to 1991 when he finally got some people interested in producing his 400-page script for The Fifth Element. Yeah, you heard me correctly. He had spent 16 years writing out the story and turning it into a kind of long-form script you'd expect from someone like Stephen King. Besson was able to get a major French studio, Gaumont, interested in the project, and in November 1991, Besson recruited French comic creators, and I'm going to butcher their names here, Jean Giraud and Jean-Claude Mézariès, for the film's production design. Besson used these two artists' comic books as massive inspiration for the futuristic design of New York City. Hell, even Jean-Claude Mézariès wrote the book, The Circles of Power, which featured a taxicab driver who flies through a congested city in a flying taxi. Seems a bit familiar. Yeah, one thing Besson has working against him is how his inspiration is sometimes anything but we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. For the next year, Besson and the team of artists he hired put together over 8,000 drawings of concept art to show to actors. The two actors that Besson had in mind right off the bat were Bruce Willis and Mel Gibson. Both actors were renowned the world over, and honestly, I think Mel Gibson would have knocked it out of the park, but he turned down the role. Willis, on the other hand, was really reluctant to take on the role of Korben Dallas because his last two films, Billy Bathgate and Hudson Hawk, were both ravaged by critics. To that I say, kiss my ass, critics. Hudson Hawk is fucking awesome. But at the same time, Willis needed something to be a hit for him to get his career back on track, and he was just unsure about The Fifth Element. So Besson, without the ability to lock down a major actor in the main role, they weren't able to find another production company to take on the budget of nearly $100 million. Nowadays, we don't scoff when we hear about a $100 million budgeted film, but in the 90s, that was insane. It was risky, and Besson hadn't proven himself yet. And sadly, in December of 1992, production stopped on the film without any prior warning, and the team simply disbanded. But you gotta remember, in Hollywood, people have a tendency to fail upwards. And Luc Besson put The Fifth Element down to write and direct the lower budgeted Leon, or The Professional as you might know it here in the States. Look, I know this is a podcast about The Fifth Element, but can we stop for a second to quickly admire the awesomeness and utter badassedness of Leon? Jean Reno, Natalie Portman, and Gary Oldman in one of his best roles? Yes, please. I'll have to cover that one in a future episode because I effing love that movie. But anyway, while they were shooting Leon, he was still plugging away at The Fifth Element script. He was working really hard to reduce the budget to roughly $90 million before throwing the bait in the water to see if another film company wanted to produce it. It was during this time that Karate Kid scribe Robert Mark Kamen came in to help Besson tighten up the script. In an interview I found, it seemed like he really loved Luc's imagination, but that his ability to mold the script into something manageable was just not there. The two have actually had a very long relationship afterward and collaborated on movies like The Transporter and the Taken franchises. I know we don't say this enough, at least not since Sony bought Columbia Pictures, but because Columbia had financed Leon and they had a good relationship with Besson, they actually agreed to finance The Fifth Element for him. This was actually 19 years after he started working on the script for the movie too. This is just a quick reminder that big things have little beginnings, and that it's always good to keep moving forward. Yes, I'm quoting both Prometheus and Meet the Robinsons here. This is a movie podcast. Deal with it. One of the great lessons that Besson learned while working on Leon was that he realized that working with lesser-known actors is a great way to save on the budget. It was actually this idea that finally got Bruce Willis to accept the role. This is how the story goes. One day, Luc Besson was hanging out with a producer named Barry Josephson, who had produced Willis's The Last Boy Scout and even the terrible Wild Wild West. But no, he isn't John Peters, who wanted the giant freaking spider in Superman Lives. Anyway, Bruce Willis called while the two were hanging out, and Besson asked if he could just say hi. So he grabbed the phone and he told Bruce Willis that The Fifth Element was finally going forward, but they had to go with a lesser expensive actor. Willis paused for a moment, and Besson sat in silence. Since people absolutely hate awkward silences, Willis quickly responded with, "If I like the film, we can always come to an arrangement." And just like that, he agreed to take on the movie after reading the updated script. I don't think you guys understand just how much I love this story. Not even all the top-tier Hollywood agents in the world can beat out an awkward silence. With Bruce Willis now attached to star, Besson needed to fill out the rest of the cast. Gary Oldman was an easy hire for Zorg because of their previous relationship from Leon, and Besson wildly praised Oldman's acting, calling him one of the best 5 actors in the world. And he's not wrong. Like, not at all. Next, he actually hired an unknown Milla Jovovich after interviewing roughly 300 women for the role of Lilu. And he eventually also settled on Chris Tucker as Ruby Rod, who was originally known as Lockrod, which is just a dumb name. But the name stuck on long enough to make it into the official novelization of the movie, and some have suggested that the name change was to incorporate Ruby Rod's gender-bending style, with his first name being feminine and his last name being phallic. Like, I don't know if that's true, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless. On a side note, I went looking for the novelization of the movie, and I did find it on Amazon, where the mass market paperback is only $11.44, but the original paperback is selling for $495 from one seller, and I'm not kidding about this. It's also going for $920 new. I think I might just buy the mass market paperback and give it a read, but this isn't the only Fifth Element book that's selling for an insane price. After the film's release, Besson released The Story of the Fifth Element on October 31st, 1997, which is actually part production journal and part art book. Most of this story that I'm telling you is coming from that book after being adapted for Wikipedia. And before you get mad at me for reading Wikipedia, a copy of The Story of the Fifth Element is $232 used and nearly $900 new. So cut me a little slack, okay? Anyway, being French and having used French comics as a major inspiration for this movie, Besson desperately wanted to make the film in France. But he couldn't find suitable enough facilities to film in, and so he had to, with a heavy heart, choose London and Pinewood Studios as the primary locations to film. Construction on the sets didn't begin though until October 1995, and filming with the actors began in late January 1996, and it was actually completed roughly around May 16th. It was total about a 21-week shoot for this movie, and quite frankly, you can see it. One of the interesting things is that Besson was adamant about shooting all the action shots during the daytime, because he was tired of all the dimly lit corridors and dark rooms he's seen in science fiction films, and he wanted something cheerier. Now that I think about it, you can really see that in the movie. It has this real comic book look to the lighting in the scenes. It's very colorful, very bright, and it all adds to the aesthetic. But, part of me wonders if his comment about dimly lit rooms is a critique of Ridley Scott and the darker sci-fi films that followed Alien. I mean, even the costumes were bright and colorful. In fact, this was absolutely done on purpose by the costume designer, who designed all 900 costumes worn by the extras in the movie and hand-inspected them each morning. The style that he used is described as intellectually transgressive, and its point was to challenge gender norms. Clearly, Ruby Rod is the focal point for this in the film, but that was very progressive of Besson and company to do back in the mid-90s. What's funny is that even though the movie was shot in London and financed by Columbia Pictures, it's still considered a French production, and it went on to become the costliest French movie ever made. But that isn't a bad thing per se, because the movie went on to make a lot of money when it came out the following year. Now, the movie isn't without its own bit of controversy during the filming though. Interestingly enough, the divine language that Lilu spoke in the movie was originally designed by Besson. Personally, I've never given this much thought outside of Multipass, because that's the meme everyone refers to. But in reality, Besson and Jovovich spent a lot of time practicing this divine language by speaking its 400 words to each other and going as far as to write letters to each other while on set. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is this controversial? Well, at the time, Besson was married to Maywin Le Besco, who played Diva Pavalaguna in the movie. And during the 21-week film shoot, Besson actually left his wife in order to get with Jovovich, and the two were married not long afterward. But after Besson cast her as Joan of Arc in The Messenger, and that crashed and burned, So did their marriage. At least that's my speculation. Eventually, The Fifth Element was completed and ready to be unleashed upon the world. It had its first premiere at the 1997 Cannes International Film Festival, where it was selected as the opening film. Now, Gaumont, the French company that first signed on to make the movie, wanted this to be a big spectacle, and it's rumored that they spent between $1 and $3 million just on the premiere screening alone. They built a custom screening room that was over 100,000 square feet, and guests were given a Fifth Element swatch that doubled as their ticket to the event. You gotta remember though, this was the 90s, and that was kind of cool, I guess. Now, the producers really wanted this thing to land, and they went as far as to have a ballet, a futuristic fashion show, and a fireworks display to kick off the release of the film at this event. 2 days later, the movie premiered here in the United States on May 9th, 1997. It went on to gross $17 million during its opening weekend, but it stopped dead at about $63 million for its domestic total. The movie did well in the States, but I don't think it was truly appreciated at the time. Here it is 24 years later, and we love it. But even the 15-year-old movie buff that I was at the time didn't see it until I could rent it from Blockbuster. Thankfully, they didn't rely on me, however, because 75% of the film's earnings actually came in from overseas, and the international box office finished up with just over $263 million in total. It actually held the record for the highest grossing French film for another 16 years, until The Untouchables came out in 2011. Critically speaking, The Fifth Element did pretty okay. Right now, it's sitting at a fresh rating of 70% with 67 reviews and an audience score of 86% on Rotten Tomatoes. This was really a word-of-mouth movie that found its cult audience in the years since its release, though its home video release wasn't perfect at all. It originally hit home video December 10th, 1997, but in 3 different formats. It was released on VHS, DVD, and freaking Laserdisc. I'm not kidding. I want to see this movie on Laserdisc now. Sony went on to release a Superbit edition of the film a few years later in 2001, which was given high accolades for its picture quality, but dinged on having a lack of special features. This actually changed in 2005 when the Ultimate edition of the movie was released in a double DVD set. There was a fact track feature that gave trivia about the cast, crew, and filming details while you watched it. These are always fun to watch if I'm being honest, but they're always a novelty. And the second disc had a bunch of behind-the-scenes featurettes. Now, this was during a time when DVDs were selling like hotcakes, and the studios actually gave enough of a shit to invest into the special features. These days, not so much. But a year later, the Ultimate DVD hit store shelves, and Sony released the Blu-ray of The Fifth Element at the same time. This one was panned for having a terrible picture quality and no special features. Sony actually responded to complaints by releasing a remastered version of the Blu-ray in 2007, which was good. What cracks me up though is I actually own a copy of the original Blu-ray release that I found for $5 at GameStop. I know that it's got a terrible picture quality, but I wanted to own a unique, crappy movie. But what you really got to remember is that in 2006, the HD DVD Blu-ray war was full on, and Sony needed a high-profile release to push people towards their platform. The rushed release of The Fifth Element was a bad move, and at least they did fix it eventually, but it was still panned by critics for a lack of special features. However, Sony released the remastered version in glorious 4K for the film's 20th anniversary in 2017. And right now, it's actually a pretty decent price on Amazon. It's less than $18, which is really affordable. So, what about a sequel? Right? You'd figure that the movie did well enough to warrant at least one other outing. I mean, less budgeted, but still an attempt at continuing the story, right? Well, remember the co-writer Robert Mark Kamen? He recently gave an interview with Uproxx where he brought up the idea of a sequel. And this is what he said when referring to the script. He says, "It was actually 180 pages, and then he added a second part to it." This would be Luc Besson, which made no sense either. "We were going to do it as a sequel, but it made no sense. And The Fifth Element wasn't big enough here. It was huge in the rest of the world and it's a classic, but it only did 75 million here or 80 million. And it was way ahead of its time. So we never did the sequel, and the sequel would have been taking the other 180-page thing he had and working it into a script. He and I worked for a long time. We've since done 15 or 16 films together. The quote's a bit of a mess, but remember earlier when I talked about the 400 pages that Luc Besson had originally written of The Fifth Element? Well, the sequel would have come from what was cut out of that original storyline. But like Robert Mark Collins said, it was a mess. They tried, but they couldn't nail it down apparently. Though, if I'm being honest, I doubt either one wanted to go through the hassle of making something that big again. However, Valerian exists, so I could be wrong. Oddly enough, the movie has one last controversy up its sleeve, and that was when Alejandro Jodorowsky and John Girard sued Besson after the film was released, claiming that The Fifth Element had plagiarized their comic book, The Incal. Girard sued for 13.1 million euros for unfair competition, 9 million euros in damages and interest, and 2 to 5% of the net operating revenues of the film. Jodorowsky sued for 700,000 euros, but the case was dismissed in 2004 on the grounds that only tiny fragments of the comic had been used, and also because Girard had been hired by Besson to work on the film before the allegations were made. I mean, the guy who worked on the film for over a year doing concept art, and then he sued for copyright infringement. Yeah, no, I'm okay that they lost. But what's funny about that is that Luc Besson was sued for the Guy Pearce film Lockdown by John Carpenter a few years later, claiming that it was a blatant ripoff of Escape from New York. Ultimately, Besson lost that case and had to pay out the ass to John Carpenter. Like I said at the beginning of this, he's got a bit of a habit of taking his inspirations a bit too far. But I'm still a Luc Besson fan, and I don't think that's ever going to change. I love his movies. I think they are wildly fun, great with action, and he knows the kind of audience that he is speaking to. But when I think about the legacy of The Fifth Element, to me, it's definitely a cult favorite, and it's one that the new generation of filmgoers should probably experience. While we get out of this COVID situation, I think it would be right for Sony to release the 4K edition of The Fifth Element in theaters. Let people see it on the big screen that missed it nearly a quarter century ago. Like me. I'm speaking for me. I want to see this movie on the big screen, and I think you guys might be like me on this one too. However, I always want to hear what you guys have to say about this. Where does The Fifth Element line up for you in your pantheon of movie-going experiences? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know. If you're watching this on YouTube, please leave a comment and definitely leave a like and subscribe to Podio Commentary. If you're catching this on iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts, please follow me on Twitter at mjarbo to keep an eye out for new episodes. I'll talk to you guys later. Have yourself a great day. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.